In this lesson, I'll show you a tool that allows you to sculpt geometry over animation. In order to correct deformations or create specific shapes and poses that would be difficult to convey with rig tools. This tool is called Crank Shot Sculpt. It can work with rigged characters on top of all deformations, including rigs and references. It also allows you to sculpt alembic cache. I'll demonstrate this tool on the example of such shot with a unicorn. The unicorn is stretched at some point and squashed at another. This character has a pretty simple rig, which is done in M-gear. The only deformations here are skin cluster and delta mush deformer. They give pretty mediocre stretch and squash deformations. It would be nice to add detail to these poses. This can be done just by using a technique called Shot Sculpt. In order to work correctly with this method, you need to change the scene rendering mode to Dependency Graph or DG. Now we hide the curves and open Crank from the M-gear menu. At first, you need to select an object or several objects that you plan to sculpt. I choose the body, the mouth, the eyes, the eyelashes, and the horn. Then we need to create a layer by clicking on the Create Layer button. I'll call it Base Layer. After that, you should go to the frame where you want to fix the pose, select the desired layer in the list of layers, and click Add Sculpt Frame. Now you can edit the pose, for example with the sculpting tools. Note that the formula can be edited only in the current frame. If you change the frame, the shape editing mode will be disabled. I make the middle part of the body thinner to simulate a strong stretch. I will use mostly the grab tool to easily move the surface. And I'll apply smoothing while pressing the Shift key. It is convenient to use the flatten tool to smooth out the surface. Basically, I recommend you to experiment with brushes, because all of them can be useful in some situations. I won't dwell on this topic in detail. I suppose you can figure out the brushes on your own. You can use the Erase Target tool to remove any changes, in case you have accidentally stretched out some unnecessary region. This is a brush that removes all shape changes. I'll use it to correct the legs. And I'll focus only on the front side of the body, as this is the angle from which the shot will be rendered. Also, it's worth to add some kind of creases to make the shape more interesting. Eventually, I created this pose. If you move the time slider, you'll see that the sculptor is activated only in the one frame in which I created it. This happens due to the auto keyframing setting of the Crank tool, whose behavior is adjusted with these parameters. Consequently, auto keyframe can enable or disable auto keyframing. We can also adjust the number of frames that will be included before and after the frame on which this pose was created. The pre-hold and post-hold parameters are responsible for this. We can also set up how many frames this pose will fade out in. Parameters ease in and ease out are used for this. And if we look at the outliner, we'll see that there is an object, namely the group with the name of the sculptor's layer from Crank. If we select it, an attribute appears in the channel box that corresponds to the created sculpt frame, with the frame number in which it was created as the name. The value of this attribute sets the influence or weight of the corresponding sculpt frame. 1 is 100% influence, and 0 disables the sculpt frame. Now let's look at the sculpt editor. We see the pose is enabled for only one frame. In accordance with the default setting of auto keyframing in Crank, it is assumed that you have to sculpt the pose in every frame, and it comes handy for sharp movements. However, based on the unicorn's movements, it would be nice if the pose would smoothly switch on during the transition to stretching, then stay on while the unicorn is stretched, and then smoothly fade out before squashing. For this purpose, I edit the animation of this attribute. I move the first key back a bit to the beginning of the stretch. After that, I move the last key forward, then copy the second key to which sculpt frame is enabled, so that the pose is enabled for several frames. From the Tip Tangents menu to Automatic, I shift the start slightly ahead. And I'll make the pose fade in about 2 frames. We can see that now everything is quite slow. So in order to see the result in real time, we should apply Play Blast. Finally, we got this animation. Please note that the pose can be edited at any time. In order to do that, you need to select the layer in the layer list in Crank, or directly the group with layer attributes in Outliner. Then you select the attribute corresponding to the desired sculpt frame in the channel box and click Edit Selected Sculpt Frame in Crank. Maya will navigate to the frame where that sculpt frame was created and automatically select all the objects for which that layer was created. But while editing, the sculpt frame weight must be equal to 1 in that frame. We need this in order to see the result of Sculpt. Now I move to the frame where the unicorn is squashed and add one more sculpt frame. So I select the layer and click the Add Sculpt Frame button. After that, by analogy with the first pose, I add details. I'll try to simulate the preservation of volume during squashing and add some kind of creases. You should keep in mind that you can edit geometry with ordinary tools at the level of points, edges, or faces. And sculpting tools are much more suitable for such tasks. As a result, I've got this pose. Now, by analogy with the first pose, I'll edit its animation so that it shows up smoothly when squashed. I select the crank layer group. You can see that it has the attribute now that corresponds to the second sculpt frame, which was created on frame 74. Now I'll edit the animation curve of this attribute just as I did for the first sculpt frame. The unicorn remains squashed until the end of the shot, so the second sculpt frame should simply show up and should not fade out. Therefore, the last key on the curve can be simply removed. I apply Play Blast. As a result, we get this animation. The crank tool has a handy right-click context menu. In the list of layers, you can select objects included in that layer. You can disable and edit the selected layer or all the layers, as well as isolate objects included in the layer for easy editing. Now I select only the horn and add another layer. We click Create Layer. I'll call it Horn. Then I select the new layer, turn off auto keyframing, and add a sculpt frame. Then I go into point editing mode and bend the horn like this. Notice that if auto keyframing is disabled, the created pose is always on. Also notice how the horn behaves. You can see that the created pose considers its rotation. This happens due to the fact that the point displacements are recorded in the tangent space during creation of sculpt frames. That is why you can use this method to create, for example, face movements on the animated character, and they'll consider the head rotations and work correctly. However, there may be situations when the surface is heavily deformed relative to its state at the time of creation of sculpt frame. For example, in the area of the joints. As a result, artifacts may appear. This is the main disadvantage of crank. Unfortunately, in such cases, the only solution is to create additional adjustment layers. In some situations, when there are artifacts that aren't heavily displayed as well, you can use the delta mush deformer to smooth out the surface. For example, if I shift the sculpt during squashing a little earlier in time, you'll see that small artifacts appear on the surface. I apply the delta mush deformer to the body by reducing the displacement attribute to 0, so that the delta mush just smooths out the geometry. You can animate the intensity of the delta mush deformer through the envelope attribute so that smoothing occurs only in the right moments. You can also paint the weight of the delta mush deformer to limit its effect on certain regions and surfaces. All in all, despite some limitations, this is a very powerful but simple tool that gives you full control over the shape of your character. This is especially true for stylized animation. Well, that's the end of the lesson. Thank you for your attention and see you in the next one.